Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new podcast by IMEO Institute for Middle East Options. We're very glad to be here to be talking about the new developments in the region on the geopolitical, economic, political, social levels. And I'm very excited to be joining Ambassador Charlotta Sparre, the Deputy Director of the Stockholm Institute for Peace and Research, and I will give the floor to her to take us into a deep dive on what is going on in the region at the moment.
It's really great, Zine, to do this first podcast of IMEO with you. Maybe we should just start introducing ourselves. So as Zine said, I'm the Deputy Director of SIPRI, Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, have a long background as Swedish diplomat and have primarily worked in the Middle East and North Africa region, and with the region also from the European side. And Zine, who are you?
So thank you, Charlotta. I'm Zine Labidine Ghebouli, a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, specializing in Euro-Mediterranean cooperation and North African affairs. I focus mostly on the geopolitics and the developments of the Mediterranean region, and I'm very excited to be discussing the future of this very important geopolitical space with you today.
Yeah, and in preparing this, we had great difficulties in choosing what to talk about in 45 minutes, because obviously there is so much that is going on in the region. But we have then picked three main topics that we would like to focus on. The first one is the US-Iran negotiations. The second is the continued war in Gaza. And the third is on the relationship between the Middle East, North Africa region and one of its closest neighbors, namely again, European Union, as that is a topic that both of us are very much engaged and interested in. So maybe starting off then with the US-Iran nuclear negotiations, I just want to give maybe a little bit of background for those of our listeners who have not necessarily followed all of the details. But in 2018, the first Trump administration, the US withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the so-called DCPOA. And since then, the situation has been pretty frozen. But with the new administration coming in, there has now been a resumption of the negotiations between the US and Iran. It is led by the US envoy Steve Witkoff, who is also leading the US involvement both in Gaza and in Ukraine. And he's coming in with a very new negotiation style. So far, there have been 3 meetings, and moving ahead, I saw some news today that there may be a next meeting already on Saturday in Rome. And maybe just very briefly on the US interest in this, as far as I can see at least, but I'm very keen to hear what you think, Zine. But the Trump administration being very keen to avoid further conflicts in the region. Also a strong interest not only from the US, but I think broadly from the whole of the international community to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions. And at the same time, we're seeing very much of a, so to say, transactional style in this. From the Iran side, we see, of course, a very weakened Iran compared to where we were in the negotiations that in the old format was not only with the US, but also with a very strong European involvement. But we see a weakened Iran, but an Iran that also, as far as I can tell, want to avoid a conflict and where the regime at the same time is very keen to stay. So what are your thoughts, Zine, on the implication and what does this mean for the region and for the world?
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. I think you've summarized the situation pretty well, and I think as anyone who has been witnessing and following the news of this U.S. Iran new nuclear negotiations, the first thing that comes to mind, and which is really in line with most of the international developments and also in the regional space, is that we live in a new age where maybe the only certainty is the uncertainty and the unpredictability of our new region and the regional security order, the geopolitical shifts. Because at the time that many international observers, even experts, were probably expecting a more of a radical stance towards the Iran nuclear program, towards Iran itself, or the regime, or also the establishment as a whole. There is now negotiations which, following the news, as you mentioned before, it's going pretty well according to some. But at the same time, one cannot really exclude the risk of a military escalation at the end of the day, because as President Trump said it himself, while the negotiations are going, there is nothing off the table. And in that sense, I think this unpredictability sends a message to the entire region that everybody needs to defend their own interests at the end of the day. And this is where I think it's becoming even more interesting with the engagement and involvement of other regional actors, especially from the Gulf region. A few days after the beginning of the negotiations, I remember there was a historic visit by senior Saudi official to Iran, and meeting with the supreme leader, also with the president. And this visit would have been not expected, and it is unprecedented in its own merit. But I think it is worth noting that while the U.S. may remain the major force in the region, there are other forces emerging, particularly from the Gulf, particularly also the GCC countries, especially Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and also Qatar. In that sense, I think it's worth following how this regional security order is shifting with the involvement of these actors. And finally, I think, and I would love to hear your thoughts more about that. I think it's, as you mentioned before, these negotiations come at a time of a fragilized Iran on the regional level. I think everybody knows that whatever is called the axis of resistance took a very fatal blow over the past few months, starting with October 7. It has been dismantled almost with the decapitation of Hezbollah, for instance, with the fall of the Assad regime. And then, in that sense, I think it's important to see how the regional actors are reacting to these developments, especially with the Saudi-Iranian detente, and with other actors who may not necessarily want a new war in the region. But again, that's from an analytical perspective. And I think, again, as it is a diplomatic effort at the moment, I'd be very, very keen to hear your thoughts from a diplomatic angle as well, considering your background and experience on the matter.
Yeah, no, I very much share some of the thoughts, and not least the question of uncertainty. Just as you say, I think that we're living in incredibly uncertain times, and it's very difficult to make any assessment. Also, in that it's a question of what happens if it doesn't work, and what are the escalation risks if the negotiations would not be concluded in a good way. Even if they would be successful, what does successful mean in this regard? Is it just a pure containment, or is it actually leading to something that would be going beyond the nuclear file? Would there be any prospect at all of lifting sanctions, which in the end I would assume is the, so to say, the key carrot and interest for Iran in the extension? But then also on the question that you ask, so to say, from a diplomatic perspective, having been involved in quite a few negotiations, it is often a very lengthy process, but also where, as they say, the devil is in the details. And it is something that constantly in all negotiations and mediations are are questions of how will then, what will be implemented, what is the interpretation of what has been agreed, and so on. And as far as I understand, with the team around Witkoff, it's really at a very, so to say, at high level in terms of being people very close to the administration, but not necessarily those who have been involved and who have a long background at technical level and at diplomatic level. So, and of course, we have very little insight on who is actually there and how much are they building on the experiences, the knowledge, and the know-how of the past negotiations. Another uncertainty is obviously the regional situation, and as you mentioned, the question of other players in the region, and you mentioned the Gulf and the very different relationship that we are seeing, or at least the different relationship that we are seeing today between Iran and the GCC countries compared to what we saw, and in particular with Saudi Arabia, compared to what we saw in the past. But also we can, of course, not but mention the absolutely crucial role of Israel in this as well, and where Israel's security concerns need to be taken into consideration, of course, and I'm sure is taken into consideration in different ways by the American side. So there's plenty more, of course, to say on the Iran negotiations. I am sure that other colleagues will be picking up on this in future podcasts, but maybe it's time for us now to move over to a sadly continuing conflict in the region, and look a little bit at the situation in Gaza and the conflict there, and the repercussions both for the rest of the MENA region, but also beyond and on a global level. And just maybe starting there with a little bit of a recap, the ceasefire that we saw in the beginning of the year was broken in the middle of March. And in the past month, we have seen the Israeli military expanding its operations in Gaza, not least in Rafah. And UN has stated that some 65% of Rafah has now become a no-go zone. There's a lack of humanitarian access. UN agencies are reporting that food stocks are exhausted, and humanitarians are continuing to warn of hunger spreading and deepening. It's, of course, very difficult to have a full insight of what is happening in Gaza. We're getting a lot of reporting from incredibly courageous, both humanitarian workers, journalists, and others on the ground. But international journalists have no access to Gaza. In the meanwhile, it's worth mentioning, and before letting you reflect a little bit on so to say what this means for the region, still I think important to also underline that there is very intense efforts that are going on to mediate and negotiate a new ceasefire agreement. There were some cautiously positive signals coming out earlier this week, but it's very difficult also here to tell how they will develop. Strong efforts by a lot of both regional players, international players, And in the short term, of course, first for ceasefire and humanitarian access, but in the longer term, it will, of course, be essential to also see increased efforts on sustainable solution and regional dialogue and collaboration, and hopefully ultimately two-state solution. But is that realistic, Zine? And what do you see in all of this?
Before maybe getting into the beef of this war, I think from a humanitarian perspective, my heart honestly shrank as you were discussing the where we are today at the on the ground in Gaza. And I think it is very important to take a minute out of this regional perspective and focus that beyond these numbers and these statistics of the UN, of who died and who lived, there are human stories. There are stories of children, of innocent people, of those who have nothing to do with the war. And honestly, I think the incapacity, what really strikes me at first is the incapacity of the rules-based order as it is, as we know it, to stop this indescribable war for almost a year and a half now, which remains shameful, honestly, not really only for those who are involved in this war, but for all of us as humans, especially as we are witnessing this war firsthand through social media and through the news. But it is also, in a way, telling about the promised peace that we never got. My generation never got, your generation never got in this region. We were always promised that things will eventually settle. And I think amongst all of the actors, the Palestinians themselves on the ground, and everyone really involved in this war is depressed, also sort of lost hope on the eventuality of this war and this conflict ending one day. But maybe it's also as controversial as that may sound, I also like to see opportunities in challenges. And maybe the Gaza war was in some way the death certificate of a former regional order, of a security architecture that is no longer working for anyone in the region. And as we talked with the US-Iran negotiations, the issue is much bigger than two countries. The issue is about a region that still fails to see its way back to security, development, reconciliation, and integration. And I think any possible solution on or resolution on the Gaza war, now moving a bit more to the analysis perhaps, will eventually have its repercussions and consequences, not only on the Palestinian and Israeli politics from one hand, but on the overall regional integration and peace initiatives in that sense. And maybe just before getting your thoughts on this from also a European perspective, something that I've noticed from the region is that this war is a clear message that despite all integration, normalization efforts, the economic initiatives, the question of the Palestinian future is central to any sustainable peace and resolution in the region. And despite all high-level visits, I don't think any peace initiatives would work as long as the Palestinian rights and the prospects of peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the prospects of securities, guarantees for the Palestinians and for the Israelis are not being discussed in a comprehensive way. And on that, I think it's time perhaps to take into account all of all of the region's parties' perspectives, and to really have a conversation without taboos. And maybe another sort of controversial opinion is that there must be a day when everyone holds their leaders accountable for whatever is happening. The Israelis from their side, the Palestinians also from their side, because eventually it's not about the leaderships of either countries. It's about, again, as I said, the stories of the people who are dying from both sides, who are going through humane tragedy, really. And maybe one last thing, which I will be keen also to get your perspective from the other side. on the impact of this war, because one thing that we noticed since October 7 of 2023, this war is not really limited to the MENA region, not even to the Mediterranean basin. It has escaped to impact everybody's future, not only the power and the influence of European actors and the West in general, but also communities and local populations and the new generation in the West itself, as we've seen everywhere from London to New York to Paris to Brussels. I think that is really worth reflecting on, because at the end of the day, what's the way forward? Because instead of looking at what happened only, I'm very keen to understand where do we go from here really, and how do you see sort of the impact of all this on the European societies on the way forward?
A lot of very important things to unpack, and I think I'll park the European reflections just a little bit for a moment. But first, I think when you were talking about how it is affecting the whole of the world, I think it's also so that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has remained the unresolved conflict in the region, and that has been there for decades and for generations. It also shows that when conflicts are not dealt with and not solved, they may have get less of international attention for a while, but they will resurface and they will come up again, and they will have ripple effects on developments both in their neighborhood, but not least with this conflict also on an international level. The second thing that I want to pick up on of what you mentioned is what we are seeing on the ground and the enormous traumas on all sides. And the recognition of these traumas and the need to work, and one of the things that I hear most frequently in the region is, and not only with this conflict, but in particular with the developments over the last 1.5 years, is the need to also work on mental health issues and to deal with the human elements in this. Recognizing these traumas, but also taking efforts to avoid the dehumanization that wars tend to bring with themselves. This also links to what you said about the multi-generational elements. This is a conflict that has been going on where several generations have their own stories, and again on several different sides, both amongst Palestinians and amongst Israelis. And this also means that each generation will somehow need to both deal with their own challenges and problems, but also with the challenges and the traumas of the generation before and the generation after. So working with intergenerational dialogue and bringing together people from different generations, both in dealing with the past, with the present, and planning for the future, is something that I think is absolutely crucial. On the question of the rules-based order, and clearly we are seeing, and there I agree with you, we see a lot of things that are being seriously shaken. And I hear from many in the region an increased questioning also of the West's interest, ability, willingness to stand up for international principles. But we are also seeing how the part of the systems that are part of this rules-based order that are getting even more of an attention. And I'm thinking, of course, not least of both the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, and the way that they have, so to say, stepped forward. Another element I think that is interesting is to see how the region itself is developing and how it is engaging, and how we see the Gulf countries very much stepping forward and playing a much more active role, while of course neighboring countries to the conflict, Egypt and Jordan, are directly affected and need to be part of any kind of solution that will be found to the different and multiple layered problems. To so to say, maybe not now go into much on the European reactions. I'll keep that maybe for the next round. I'll move us over, however, to the MENA region and one of its closest neighborhoods, namely in the European neighborhood. And where we have an intertwined geography, what happens in one region directly affects what is happening in positive and negative in the other region. Many of the different challenges that we are facing are joint challenges, whether they are on security, on economy, on migration, on energy, on climate, or on economic development. We have a whole machinery of collaboration. In 1995, the Euro-Mediterranean cooperation started, so it is now celebrating its 30th anniversary. Over the last few years, we've also seen an increasing engagement between the Gulf countries and the EU, beyond the trade relations that already have been there. And we are also seeing now the European Union looking at developing a new pact for the Mediterranean. We have agreed, you and I, that there are a couple of events that we will highlight here that have happened in April. So one is the visit by France President Macron to Egypt, and the other one is a high-level forum on the future of the Mediterranean. Zine, it would be great to both understand what happened during this visit by Macron, why it is significant, and then also the forum, why does it matter?
Yeah, I think you've layered the transition really well, because eventually I think, as we said before, despite the centrality of some questions like the US-Iran, like the Palestinian question, the Gaza war, Israeli security guarantees, it's all part of a bigger game, of a bigger shift of geopolitical order in the region. And I think this is where we see the role and the significance of Macron's visit, because eventually I think it shows that the European Union and its member states are paying closer attention to the southern neighborhood, because eventually with the shift of this geopolitical order, old partners are withdrawing, new partners are coming in, and everybody is following their interests. And the interests, I remain convinced that despite all of the talks on this shift to the east, also the influence of actors like China and Russia, I think Macron's visits, along with other initiatives from leaders of other EU member states, highlight that regardless of what we do, we are linked by history, geography, common interests, and eventually the EU MENA and the Euro-Mediterranean frameworks in that sense are a common effort. And this is why, despite, again, all this talk about shifting east and changing partners, I think there is a growing and extended hands from the European side to the MENA region. And I am a firm believer that reconstructing a common region requires common effort, common engagement, mutual understanding, dialogue, honesty and the involvement from all actors. And it is our responsibility as people from this region to also engage in that process and to not only criticize the reality that we have, but to shape the reality that we want to see in this region. And this is where I think it's important to notice other initiatives like the Parliamentary Assembly of the Union for the Mediterranean, the Forum for the Mediterranean, which took place in Granada early April. I think the most important aspect about it was this inclusivity and this hope for a better region, this hope for something better, something more centered on development, on facing common challenges, on reconstructing the region for a region that works for everyone. And I think the entire work that's going on, whether from the Granada meeting, also to the ongoing consultations with the newly established commissioner for the Commission for the Mediterranean, also the newly established DG Director General for Middle East and North Africa at the European Commission. All of this, I think, show that we are at a phase of re-evaluation of our cooperation mechanisms amid all the changes that are happening. And despite all the challenges that we are seeing, it is also clear from a MENA perspective that the EU has a growing role to play in this region, and that everyone from the MENA to the EU, we must engage in some self-reflection process on what worked and what didn't work. And they would honestly stress on this inclusivity from both sides of the Mediterranean, because eventually the region is not the property of any leader or the property of any any official representative. It is our property, and our means civil society, means think tanks, means academics, means private sector, means citizens of this region at the end of the day. And I think it's very interesting to note this shift from the European side and to highlight its reason, which I'm sure you have more insights on that, and what is really I'll be also interested in hear what is really driving the Europeans in their approach with the region these days.
Yeah, well, both you and I have over the last year been engaged in a number of dialogues, bringing people together from, so to say, the southern Mediterranean countries and the northern Mediterranean, plus the rest of the EU together for discussions on these topics. And I cannot, of course, but start with saying that Europe was, for very obvious reasons, deeply, profoundly, and completely shaken by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the following war on Ukraine. And that is something that has been taking and still takes a lot of the energy, the mind space. The whole security thinking is of course profoundly and deeply shaken. The uncertainty of exactly where and how the transatlantic relationship will develop is something that adds in a new further dimension to this. But looking at my own country, Sweden, a country that has been neutral or non-aligned, has not been in wars for over 200 years, but that decided together with Finland to join NATO, and a major step that only, as I see it, would or could happen because of this deep sense of insecurity and being shaken at the foundation. So this somehow led, at least for the Northern European countries, Eastern European countries, but I think to a large extent for the whole of the European Union, to somehow putting down a lot of our time, our energy, our resources in every way to support Ukraine. And that continue and will continue for a very long time to be an absolutely vital and key interest. That being said, just as you said, we are also intertwined not only with our eastern neighborhood, but also with our southern neighborhood. So from a European perspective, it is essential that we continue to engage also in the south. Obviously, Mediterranean countries, not least Italy, France, Spain, Greece, have continuously played much more of that role. But I think it's also important to remember that very many European countries now have a large part of our population who have an origin in the region. And that also is something that affects our internal domestic policy. And that connects to what you said a bit earlier on also the Israeli-Palestinian question and how that is a question we are living in, whether people like it or not, whether that is up to each and every one of individuals, but it is a question of we are living in a much more globalized world where there is less of homogeneity, if we like that. However, I think in the current landscape that we are seeing, we see much more of an interest-based policy, and with that very easily comes also a more transactional policy. And while I fully and totally subscribe to the need to be interest-based and to actually stand up for that, because I think that one of the problems in the past was that we didn't necessarily talk about our interests. But my diplomatic experience tells me that if you only push for your own interest and you don't have an openness to listen to the interest of your counterpart, it's very difficult to get anywhere. So it really is a question of developing the mechanisms that we have to listen to each other, and just what you said on how can we actually have more honest, maybe conversation, and look at the challenges, look at what has worked and what has not worked, and not only in pointing finger and saying that the other side is not living up to the promises, but also a bit of self-reflection, I think is called for here. But I would also be really interested to hear your reflection before we move on to another topic that I want to bring up. But you spoke about the inclusivity. But how do we do that? And not least when it comes to the very large young population, we're talking about a region, after all, that has a great majority of the population being young, and young people very often not being included in discussions that are absolutely central to their future. So before we move on to another hot topic within the Europe MENA sphere, I'd love to hear you there.
I think it's that's a great question, honestly. And I think the aspect of the youth segment in this newly established or to be established geopolitical order is often dismissed. But I go from a simple premise usually, and I've told you that before. I think it's the question of the future is not a question that could be imposed on the youth. It is a question where the youth must give their opinion, because eventually it is them who are going to live in this world, who are going to live in this region, who are going to assume the consequences of whatever geopolitical order or whatever cooperation mechanism we go for. But it is really about giving them a platform and giving them a voice at the end of the day.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to maybe go back to the question of security. As I said, I'm as the director of deputy director of SIPRI, I can't but also share our big highlight of this month and week, namely the launch of SIPRI's report on military expenditure. We have noticed that the military expenditure has increased by 9.4% in real terms globally in 2024 compared to last year. And this is the steepest year-by-year increase since the end of the Cold War. But while it has increased in the whole of the world, it has been a particularly rapid growth in both Europe and in the Middle East region. The MENA region saw an increase of 15% in 2024. Israel's military expenditure surged by 65%, which was the steepest annual increase since the Six-Day War in 1967. And also Lebanon had a very steep increase by 58% after several years of lower spending. We have seen less of an increase in many other countries. And worth noting is also that Iran's military spending actually fell by 10% in real terms, despite its involvement in regional conflicts. But here, of course, it would be very interesting also to hear your analytical views on what does this mean?
I think first I would recommend to everyone to read that report, because CPRI's reports are usually the high mark or the landmark of these military and arms dynamics in the region. But from the figures that you've mentioned, it strikes me first that on a first base reflection, what world are we working for eventually if these military spendings, regardless of the regional context? I think focusing security only on arms procurement, on gearing up for war rather than gearing up for or preparing for sustainable development and the prosperous future, really has to make us think and reflect of what we are doing exactly. And on that note, I think I have two primary, very brief observations. First, maybe it's time to move ahead from the traditional lenses that describe security only as a sort of this military or frozen conflicts in that sense, and extend it to other areas where it matters, also like education, like development, digitalization, all of what is considered today as a human security. Because I just, as somebody from this young generation, I cannot envision myself to be living in a region whose future is always split between superficial stability and conflicts at the end of the day. Maybe it's time to give hope. And on that note, going back perhaps to what you mentioned earlier about this youth segment, to end on maybe a positive and hopeful note, that I'm one of those who don't really believe that your future is predestined. I think destiny is what we make it to be. Our future is what we make it to be, and perhaps one way to encourage inclusiveness and an inclusive process in the region is to engage ourselves as a young population. Maybe it's time to stop, as you said, the blaming whatever the old generation happened, and takes matters into our hands, because the future is ours. And I think it is time to not only be active citizens of our countries, but of our region. And see the future of the world through what we could make it to be, not as a predestined region full of despair and conflicts at the end. And I would really like to also hear your perspectives on these issues and how to move forward from here, maybe towards a more hopeful region where we are all engaged in an equal, just, and prosperous development process.
Yes, and looking at the watch, I realized that will require us to come back maybe in another podcast in the future. But I think it's wonderful that we could end on this note that history is not written, but we actually write it. But also the call for working not only on the national security, but also on human security and ecological security. I want to thank you, Zine. Always wonderful to see you, and I very much enjoyed this conversation. Also, thanks to everyone who listened in live and who will listen in later on. The next podcast in this series will be on May 28th. And if you wish to know anything more, please contact IMEO and sign up for future events. Thank you very much, and have a good evening, morning, whatever it is where you are.
It was a pleasure, Charlotta.
Thank you.